just do that.
And do they stop that music? Like, will that stop because it seems to
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. And welcome back to the main stage of the Word on the Streets community pop-up. My name is Katherine Bruce, and I'm the Executive Director of the Planet in Focus International Environmental Film Festival, which happens every year in Toronto, every October. So we're opening soon. I am absolutely delighted to be your host during this next event featuring activist Maude Barlow on her new memoir celebrating her lifelong work in activism called Still Hopeful. Before we begin this event, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the history of the place where we're gathered today. The City of Toronto exists because of the Toronto Purchase, also known as Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation in 1805, with the final claim settlement happening in 2010. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit to create, to care for, and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace, which we all now share responsibility in upholding. The Dish with One Spoon was born in part out of the Anishinaabe concept of all our relations, which is the awareness that we're all connected to and reflected in all living and non-living beings around us. Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples with long histories on this land. And acknowledging this is only the first step in building a practice of land stewardship and Indigenous solidarity that honors these people. And now, please join me in welcoming Maude Barlow. It's such a thrill to have her here today with us. I have been a long time fan of Maude Barlow, so this is an incredible pleasure for me today. Maude Barlow is the best-selling author of 20 books. She sits on the board of the Food and Water Watch, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, and is a counselor with the World Future Council. She served as senior water advisor to the UN Assembly and was a leader in the campaign to have water recognized as a human right. She's the recipient of 14 honorary doctorates, the Right Livelihood Award, and is the current chancellor of Brusha University. She lives in Ottawa, Ontario. Maude, hello and welcome here to Toronto.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, everybody. It's a delight to be here.
I wanted to first ask you about, you've written 20 books, 4 decades of activism, but involved in second wave feminism, the fight against the free trade agreements, globalization, water justice. I just wondered why this book now, at this time in history, and what motivated you after all that you've done to write this particular, very beautiful, eloquent memoir?
Well, I think it's really important for us when things are tough to say that we don't give up. And in fact, to find ways to move one foot ahead of the other when in many ways despair would tell you just sit down or put the covers up over your head. I have 4 teenage grandkids, and I watch the world through their eyes. And the fact that they're learning a lot because of social media, because of really good media, I'm not talking about disinformation, what they're learning in schools and so on about the state of the planet. I worry about how that impacts them. When you're I can't imagine being 14 and being told the planet only has 10 years left, or talking about the 6th grade extinction or the acidification of the oceans. And I talk to a lot of young people, not just young people, who feel paralyzed.
Yeah.
And what they say is that it's too big. What can little me do? And I spent 45 years being an activist, and we've done a lot of stuff. People, not me, just me, many of us have made amazing change. And what you need is a sense of hope that I borrow a phrase from an American spiritual leader, Joan Halifax, her name is. She talks about wise hope. She said it's not some kind of Pollyanna-ish, everything's happy, don't worry. It's actually, yes, things are really, really concerning, but that doesn't mean that we give up. And so wise hope requires that you face reality. It requires that you take action, that you, knowing that you can't control the outcome, but you still are going to, as I say, put your hand out and touch the universe where you can and make a difference. So I think Catherine, going into the pandemic, before the vaccines, we were all kind of at home, and this was a real time to reflect about what values meant. Why did I keep going all those years? I wanted to try to figure out what got me up in the morning to continue to be an activist, and I thought I can share that with people because I've learned things, I've made mistakes, I've got things to share with people.
Absolutely, which reminds me, I believe there's a passage that you were going to read from, because it ties into my second question, about the very nature of hope. So maybe we should do that first before I ask my next question.
Okay, quick reading. This is from the first chapter, which really describes the concept of hope, as I say, wise hope. And the title of this piece of it's called Overcoming Despair and Facing Fear. Grief is not despair. Grief can lead to understanding, acceptance, and engagement. Despair leads to a dead end. Clarissa Pinkola Estes is an American poet, post-trauma specialist, Jungian psychologist, and the author of many books, including the bestseller Women Who Run with the Wolves. I love that book and that title. She urges us not to spend your spirit dry by bewailing these difficult times, no matter how righteous our rage. In a spring 2020 publication called Letter to a Young Activist During Troubled Times, Estes asks us to embrace these difficult times exactly because we were made for them. For years, she says, we have been learning, practicing, been in training for, and just waiting to meet on this exact plane of engagement. In any dark time, there is a tendency to veer toward fainting over how much is wrong or unmended in the world. She says, do not focus on that. There is a tendency to fall into being weakened by persevering on what is outside your reach and by what cannot yet be. Do not focus there. That is spending the wind without raising the sails. Estes admits that she feels despair. Of course, we all do. But she says, and I love this, I do not keep a chair for it. I will not contain it. I will not entertain it. It is not allowed to eat from my plate. Despair can be countered by action, however small. We are needed, she says. That's all we have to know. Ours is not the task of fixing the entire world all at once, but of stretching out to mend the part of the world that is within our reach. Any small, calm thing that one soul can do to help another soul, to assist some portion of the poor, suffering world, will help immensely. It is not given to us to know which acts or by whom will cause the critical mass to tip toward an enduring good. For many people, the knowledge that real hope demands action creates fear. What can I do? What if I'm not a leader? What if I speak up and say something stupid? What if I advise the wrong thing? What do I have to add? Who would listen to me? Will I be in harm's way? Am I brave enough? Aileen Kelsey is a Canadian environmental scholar, educator, and public speaker. She has a new book called Hope Matters: Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical to Solving Environmental Crisis. She says that the culture of fear that has grown up around the climate crisis is paralyzing for many, especially the young. Badgering someone you love will not change them, she says. As she writes, and bombarding kids with messages of gloom and telling them it is up to them to save the world with little support for how those messages make them feel is a recipe for paralysis. She reports that the messaging from mainstream media and from academics and from environmental groups is largely centered on the crisis and not the solutions. By focusing on what is broken, messages about climate change make people feel that nothing has been done, and all the hard work is ahead. Kelsey strongly disagrees with that framing. When fear becomes the frame and the mindset, it is demotivating and can lead to compassion fatigue. I love that term, compassion fatigue. When we are afraid, we become less creative, less collaborative, and less capable of perseverance. And that's where the paradox comes in, she says. As a global community with climate concern at a record high, we are better positioned than ever before to take urgently needed action, yet the collateral damage on individual people of being constantly bombarded with environmental catastrophe is inhibiting our capacity to tackle the climate crisis. Conversely, there's an essential connection between hope and agency. Kelsey points to studies that show hopeful people have the ability to find different routes to a goal. I find this really interesting. A skill that can be taught. She says, in other words, we could shape our hopeful future and we could be taught how to do this. In her 2010 poem, 5 Fears to Fear and Then No More, Estes writes, going over and over one's fears is empty and emptying. Most fear, she writes, is not a failure of living fully. She advises choosing your petty fears carefully because they can grow big teeth, which I love. Fear this, she said. Fear not loving while you have the chance. Fear becoming bitter. Fear cynicism. Fear turning to stone. Fear living overwhelmed by everything. Rebecca Solnit believes, and I've written about her earlier, she's an American writer, wrote a book called Hope in the Dark. She says, to hope is to gamble. It's to bet on the future, on your desires, on the possibility that an open heart and uncertainty is better than gloom and safety. To hope is dangerous, and yet it is the opposite of fear, for to live is to risk. Hope should shove you out the door. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future makes the present habitable. Even in the face of very stark evidence of environmental destruction, there are powerful voices calling for hope. The stunning summer 2021 report from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made apocalyptic headlines around the world. You'll remember that, Catherine.
Yes.
And left many activists filled with despair. But one of the lead scientists on the project called on us to use the shocking information in the report to turn the situation around. In an editorial in The Guardian, Australian climate scientist Joelle Georges shared how hard she and 233 other volunteer scientists from 66 countries worked thousands of hours as volunteers to produce the most comprehensive report on the climate crisis to date. Why did they do this, she said? Because they care. And this is a quote from her, and I'll finish this with this quote. She said, many of us realize that we are the generation that is likely to witness the destabilization of the Earth's climate, that the people alive today will determine the fate of future humanity. Being part of a group of scientists from every corner of the world working together to try to avert disaster at this critical moment in human history changed my life. It taught me that when we align behind a collective vision, guided by strong leadership, no matter how insurmountable the challenges feel, anything is possible. Ultimately, she says, we only really have one choice to make: to stay connected with people that restore our faith in the goodness of humanity, or fall into the abyss of cynicism and despair. It really is as simple as that. You could choose to be a person that restores someone else's faith in humanity, and do what you can where you can, even when all feels lost. Because, and I love this, she says, once the despair has passed, we need to remember there is so much worth saving.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you very much. That is from the first chapter, correct? Yeah. So in the first chapter of Maud's book, she, for me, I found it phenomenal how you dove into the definition of hope in this particular context that we're living in with the climate crisis and water justice. And as someone who works in that space as well, I know at the festival we're always looking for hope, how to share hope with our audience, how to keep the belief that all is not lost, and have people not, look towards some sort of solution. So I was really fascinated by your first chapter, which really explores the history of hope, the philosophy behind it, and you define hope as the kind of hope you're talking about as active hope, inclusive hope, compassionate hope. And I wondered if you could speak just a little more to that, in a little more detail. I think it's really, really relevant today.
It's really hard for a type A like me to let go of saying, I want this change and I want it on this date. I want it to look exactly like this. But you can't control it. And one of the things that you learn in many years of activism, which I have done, is you don't know when a win is going to happen. You can't understand maybe, or you can't see a win because maybe it's not what how you describe it. But societal change comes upon us, as one of my people I quote here says, upon us like a change in weather. I go back to the women's movement. I was very involved with what's called the second stage women's movement. Just about 3 years before my mother was born, the Dominion Elections Act said no woman, idiot, lunatic, or criminal shall vote. I mean, when you think of it,
I love that lumping
in just 100 years, we have made such profound change for women. And sometimes I'll talk to young women and it's kind of like, wasn't it always like this? Well, no, there were big changes. When I was growing up in the 1950s in Ottawa, my mother couldn't get a driver's license or a visa or open a bank account without my dad's signature. And of course he would do it because he was a wonderful man, but things change. And we need to think about change in different ways. Again, I quote Rebecca Solnit, who says, progress isn't an army marching forward, it's a crab scuttling sideways. You don't know. And here's one of the most important things. You have to have faith that other people are doing important work. It's really important for us not to think, I have to take it all on my shoulders, and if I can't fix it all, well, I'm going to give up. And a lot of people do. I've watched a lot of burnout over my life of activism. Yeah. And what happens is people think they can do everything and forget that you need, as Hillary Clinton would say, a village. I'll give you a lovely example. I was very dear friends with a couple in Guelph, Ontario, who held off Walmart for 10 years. They kept Walmart out of they were going to come in and displace a bunch of small businesses, and they were going to take over an old church. And anyway, so he was an educator. He had a very British accent, and he was very proper. They were both retired. Their phone message would be, "This is Dr. Edward Griffith and Mrs. Vi Morgan. Please leave a message." They were very, very proper in that way, but they were so radical. So when he was 89, Griffiths was on a panel on Walmart and gave a passionate speech and died, like right there, with his boots on, right?
That's commitment.
That's commitment. And the next day on the front page of the Guelph Mercury, there was a picture of me and Vi and Griff and the mayor saying, "Now heaven save from Walmart," which I love because we fought Walmart when it first came in. Anyway, so that's not the story. That's the backdrop. The story is that when Vi was dying, she was 100. I went to visit her. And I said, "Come to say goodbye, Vi, and do you have any words of wisdom for me?" And she said, "Do you have a quiet mind?" And I said, "Oh, I'm looking for one, because I always want to I see something wrong and I want to do something about it, and I want everybody to do something about it at the same time, and it drives me crazy that they're not." She said, "You will have a quiet mind when you have faith that others are doing things that you don't even know about, that change will come in ways you can't understand." So the definition of hope that I came up with near the end of the book, I didn't start off with this, I had to write the book first, was this: that hope is a commitment to protect all that is good for the planet and future generations, knowing you alone cannot control the outcome, but taking action anyway. And as I say, putting your hand out to touch the universe in the place that you can, having faith others are doing the same. And then, of course, building a movement. I talk a lot in the book about how to build a movement, how to bring new people in. I mean, maybe you failed in your goal, but you brought a whole bunch of new young people in. Maybe you've got some great new research that will be used in a similar situation 10 years down the road, and then you'll win. You have to get away from the mindset there's winning and losing, especially in issues around human rights, around environmental struggles and so on. It's sometimes one step forward and two steps back, and we just are very grateful when it's two steps forward and one step back, but there will be one step back.
And it's not always linear. Oh
That's
my gosh,
right.
that's loud.
That's
it's
right.
not always linear, yeah. No, sorry, go ahead.
No. Building movements is tremendously important. I look at, for instance, the international water justice movement that we collectively built. I was just saying to Katherine when we were chatting earlier that I got into the issue of water justice not from the environmental perspective originally. It was reading free trade agreements, particularly the very first one when Ronald Reagan was president and Brian Mulroney and he cooked up this free trade agreement in Canada, and they were at the time talking about massive commercial exports of Canada's water to the US, and we were fighting this. I sat down and read this so-called free trade agreement, which is really about get government hands off everything and let the corporations make the decisions, right? And I looked at the annex at the end, and it said these are the goods, the tradable goods that are going to be subject to the new rules of these trade agreements, or this trade agreement, and it included water in all its forms, including ice and snow. So, I mean, it just set me on a journey, because I thought, how could water be a tradable good? It belongs to the earth. It belongs to all humans and all species. It belongs to the future. And I realized three things very, very quickly. The first thing is the planet is running out of accessible clean water, and it isn't just climate change, it's our abuse of water. Secondly, there is a deep division around the world, both within countries, but particularly between countries around water. We have, at the moment, 2.2 billion people who don't have access to clean drinking water, and 4.2 billion who don't have access to basic sanitation. Those are stunning statistics. And that just knocked me out. And the third thing I learned was that there's a mighty contest between those who say, everybody says, yep, it's a crisis. On one side, there are the corporate, private types who say, let the market decide. Put it on the open market like oil and gas and let corporations make the decision. And those of us on the other side who say, no, water is a human right. It is a public trust. It must not be controlled on a for-profit basis. It must be a public service. And we have to fight for everyone in the world to have access to clean, safe public water. So we built a movement. We started here in our country. We started with many municipalities pledging to become what we call blue communities, so that they would not allow privatization of water. And we were very, very conscious of the crisis on First Nations, many First Nations communities around the lack of access to clean water and sanitation. But then I started traveling around the world, and I've been everywhere from, the highest echelons of the United Nations and so on, to the poorest slums in the world, and broke my heart. And I was determined that we were going to get the United Nations to finally recognize the human rights to water and sanitation, which happened on July 28th, 2010. I was in the balcony of the General Assembly at the United Nations. I thought we were going to lose. The government of Canada at the time, under Harper, was opposed. They led the fight against against the right to water. The World Bank was opposed. The U.S. was opposed. Great Britain was opposed. The big water companies were opposed. We won. 121 countries voted in favor. None of them voted against. 42 abstained. And since then, all the countries have adopted water as a human right. So I've won some and I've lost some, and I like winning better. But there's no such thing as a complete and total win, because once you've won that symbolic thing, then you have to make it real. And that's where the work moves to and continues.
Yeah. What a moment to be in the UN that day.
It was fabulous.
Yeah. I think that sort of leads into my next question, which is related to what you just said about building movements and celebrating those wins, but understanding there's lots of deep work that lies beyond in the execution, obviously. And I wondered if maybe you could share some of your thoughts on what are the more positive things that are happening out there.
Yeah.
We have witnessed, the wildfires of California and BC very recently, the horrible flooding in Pakistan, and it's hard not. The headlines have been definitely very gloomy, especially around climate change.
Yeah.
And I just wondered where you see some of the key, more positive, larger moments.
Well, I've written many books and many reports on the negative part of it. And so
I've read
when
them.
I wrote this book, I disciplined myself. I would say, okay, you've got 2 paragraphs to write what the problem is. And a part of me would say, I can't write what the problem is in 2 paragraphs. Are you crazy? But I'd say, yes, you can, because this is about what people are doing. And it's not just what we should do. A lot of books, a lot of work is about what we all should do. I'm talking about what is happening around the world. We have never, ever been at a better place to commit to climate change, changing the climate crisis, to reinstating a healthy climate. We know so much. And I think the thing, Katherine, that made me most hopeful in the research that I did on this was the understanding of the need to protect biodiversity, protect and restore. Yes, we need to get those greenhouse gas emissions down. Yes, we know we're not doing it fast enough, far enough. But you should know there are many good treaties that have either taken place or are in planning on methane, on coal, on plastics. There's a growing agreement around the world about the desperate need to do something about the plastics. And there's a wonderful project on the oceans people may not know about. They are actually going to complete the emptying of you read about the gyre in the ocean with all that huge area of garbage. There's a project that is removing that gyre, that garbage patch. There are several of them, but the great big one, and they believe that they'll have it totally removed by 2030. This is enormous. Now, we have to stop producing so much garbage, particularly plastic garbage, because we shouldn't have to be removing it from, the aquatic life, from the whales and so on. So, yes, but there is good work being done. But the thing that I was most excited about is what I call a tsunami of understanding that we need to protect soil, watersheds, forest, wetland. We need to stop cutting all of this stuff down and rebuilding it. And looking through this, and I just want to say in Canada, the government has agreed to plant 2 billion trees. Now, they got to be the right kind of trees in the right place. We can talk about that. We have promised what's called 30 by 30, which is that 30% of our biodiversity will be protected by 2030. There are 10 new national parks planned here in Canada, big, huge national parks, and previously two have been announced for protection in the last few years. We have this government, and I'm not partisan here, I'm just saying when governments do what we ask them to do, we should sometimes say it. This government has ended 135 long-term boil water advisories in First Nations communities. They're on track to end them all within a couple of years. No other government ever tried that. So, and I think that's a sign of a deep desire for reconciliation on the part of Canadian settlers, non-Indigenous Canadians. So there are many, many good signs that we need to look to. One of them coming from the pandemic. People say, could anything good have come from the awful pandemic? Well, it was very, very clear right from the get-go that the lack of sanitation in many countries of the global south was a real crisis. I mean, can you imagine being in a community where your community health clinic, your community hospital has no running water? The schools have no running water. The girls aren't going to go to school because there's no private sanitation for them. But it became very clear right away, when we heard about COVID, everybody said, wash your hands with soap and warm water. Well, within, I don't know, a week of that, the United Nations said, oh, just a reminder, over half the population of the world doesn't have a place to wash their hands with soap and warm water. Just a phenomenal reality if you stop and think about it. There has been a lot of funding from wealthier governments and aid agencies to poorer communities of the global south to build real sanitation systems for the first time. And these would be permanent. It's not like they're there just for COVID. They're there because they've been desperately needed. So can something good come from something bad? Maybe the way we look at the values that we have all been living with, competition and more stuff and, you know, more growth. There's a lot of talk about alternative economies. You would love I write about a woman named, she's an economist from Great Britain, Raworth, Kate Raworth, her name is, and she's written a book called The Donut Economy. And she says this is an alternative to the growth economy, which is, as we know, is cutting down forests and taking too many fish from the sea and too many minerals from the ground and all of the things we know that it's doing. I love her donut economy because on the outer frame are the 12 environmental issues, concerns, protections that we can't overshoot because we know that we will not live and nature will not live. And then on the inner ring are 12 of the needs that humans have to live well, not to live wealthily, but to live, as they say in Latin America, bien vivre, to live within the limits but live well, and everybody lives well, including healthcare and education, social equality, so on. And she says the sweet spot, the donut, is that in between where we can, yes, of course we still make stuff. We're not anti-technology, of course, but we question what we're doing, and we question the rate at which we're destroying the natural world. And the city of Amsterdam has adopted a 100-year plan based on the donut economy, which is gorgeous. I go into it here because it's really practical ways we can look at our municipal elections. And I would urge us all to get involved in your upcoming municipal election, do something, vote for good people. So much around climate and everything else starts at the municipal level, from bike lanes and tree coverage and parks and you know, the type of buildings that are built. So much starts at that level. And, you know, when I feel a little angry and let myself feel angry, I am angry that so many people didn't vote in the provincial election. And we mustn't let that happen again. That's that feeling that doesn't matter what I do. My vote doesn't count. I'm just one person. I can't make a difference. And we need to. But I've found myself really listening to people like Gutierrez, who is the Secretary General of the United Nations. He is the first one to ever speak the language that you and I would speak. I mean, he really is deeply committed, deeply concerned about the climate crisis, deeply concerned about the injustice of the water crisis. And he speaks with such passion about the need for a new economy. But then you get institutions like the International Monetary Fund, which is used to be this really right-wing organization that gives out money to and funding loans to poor countries, but with all these ties that are going to make corporations rich. They sound like me. The International Monetary Fund has been putting out reports saying that the climate crisis and the pandemic crisis have shown us that the private sector can't do it. Certainly can't do it by themselves. That when there isn't money to be made, they're gone. And that there's a need for what they call activist government again, and with the argument for good health care and that food justice, food sovereignty. These are issues that we're going back to. And I find there's an opening here for really new and exciting thinking. Yes, it's also a contested area because, of course, there are others with very, very different ideas, and there's a great deal of ugly, ugly disinformation out there, as you all know. But it's a moment for us to say it's clear that the whole notion of unregulated free trade, corporations controlling everything, privatization of services, deregulation of rules to protect the environment. It went way too far, way too far, and we have to come back. And so what is that? Where are we coming back to? We can start to think through, having seen how this model failed, when even Biden the other day, President Biden said, that trickle-down theory never worked, stop talking about it, it was always bogus. He's right, it never did. It worked for the wealthy at the top, it did not work for most other people. So what can we build in its place? What can we learn from what we've gone through? And I just want to say also, I write about the women's movement and what we learned and how we have taken what we learned into other movements, the movements for inclusion and racial justice and social equality and the environment. Because I remember having these debates very clearly back in the day, and we would say, we're not interested in half the pie that men have created. We don't like the pie. We want to change the recipe. We want to change what's in that pie. We want to make it more human. We want to bring a very different vision into the workings of our institutions, our governments, and so on. So I think we learned things that we were able to share with newer movements, and I think that's a beautiful kind of combination.
Yeah. I guess that was really, I just wanted to explore that a little bit more, the injustices. I think that understanding that, the notion of environmental justice and that the environment is no longer, maybe perhaps in the 1970s we looked at it a little more from a silo, and that we cannot do that.
That's right.
And that at Planet in Focus we always say our definition of the environment includes social justice. We have a broad definition of the environment. And I think it's important to understand where human rights, migration, that chemical plant has been very purposely built in a neighborhood of poorer people where, they're not going to have the means to protest, and they're going to be unjustly affected by the byproducts of that plant. So if you wanted to speak just a little bit to that, we can't have environmental change without social justice and the acknowledgement of environmental justice and what that means.
Absolutely true. The term, as you know, is environmental racism. We certainly see it with Canadian mining companies, and Canadian mining companies are the worst in the world, by the way, in terms of human rights abuses, environmental abuses. They go into poorer communities in poorer countries, and they basically do a deal with the government. Money, I'm convinced, a lot of money changes hands, and they get access to the community as workers. They can dump their toxics in that watershed. Nobody's going to say anything.
Lots of promises up front.
All sorts of promises up front. That's environmental racism. It's environmental racism in our country when the worst of extractive energy exploration or mining happens in or near indigenous communities. It's environmental racism when inner city African Americans in cities like Detroit and many other American cities have their water shut off because they can't afford to pay the rising rates of water because it's been privatized and corporations are making so much money for it. I did a lot of work in Detroit. I just got involved with this wonderful group of people who put the environment, welfare issues, social justice issues just together in the most wonderful way, because they said, here we are on the Great Lakes and we have no water. I mean, I was in a home one night and they said early in the morning we're expecting these guys and private contractors to come in and shut the water off. They came in at 6 in the morning and they shut the water for the whole block. And that means, try to think of it, no water. You can't flush your toilet, you can't wash your dishes, you can't run a bath or a shower. If you have elderly people who are sick, if you have a child, none of it. You have to go out with your buckets and go to the local park or the local library or whatever and fill it up and come home. And it can be months and months, maybe years before that water gets turned on because the prices are too high. That's environmental racism. And I think we learned, again, I go back to the early women's movement, it really was a white woman's movement. And we learned really deeply, I think, the need for deep diversity and deep inclusion. And I think that is a lesson that comes together in the environmental movement. And if it doesn't,
yes.
then we have to work on it harder.
I think we do have to work on it harder.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. And it's all linked. It's completely linked. We can't have one without the other, which goes back to your comments about creating a space for a new way of governing and a new way of thinking. And there's an opportunity here.
And by the way, I just want to say that it's a surprise to me as I wrote the book how often I revisited the concept of kindness. It wasn't one of the themes that I was going to write about, but I just kept coming back to it because I've seen a lot of dissension, some of it fair, some of it not, in our movements. Certainly it exists out there. I quote two writers who wrote a book called On Kindness, and they say in our Western society, kindness outside of kindness to your family is considered weakness. You know, we're a competitive society, you have to get together. I was sitting with a young woman, I'm a chancellor of Brescia University, it's the last university for women in Canada, connected to Western. And she's going through pre-doctoral, pre-screening to become a medical student. And she said the whole purpose of it is to eliminate people. You're competing against your colleagues, you're competing only on a bunch of facts. It has nothing to do with your emotional health or why you want to become a doctor or what your views are, what your ethical concepts are. It's all just competition, and it is all just to eliminate as many people to get down to that core. And I thought we needed doctors. Like, why are we doing that? So we've built so much of our society on that notion of hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And I have watched it seep into our movements, to be honest with you. It's not just sort of out there with the groups I don't like. It's inside our movements as well. And so I ended up talking a lot about the need to build into our institutions time to talk about grief and despair and self-care and finding ways to come together, to support each other. I might not agree with you totally, but how can I meet you part way so that we're not, we're not destroying each other? And I think we need to do more thinking about that, more. We need to build it more formally into our institutions and movements.
To bring more people to the table. I was curious, just talking about this age and the era we're living in, you used the term age of nature. And I wondered if you could just expand a little bit on what you meant by that, although I know you've already broached it.
Well, I think that social change comes upon us when enough people realize something. And I go back to the women's movement. I mean, in the 1980s, in the House of Commons, one of the MPs joked about wife assault. He used to call it wife battering. And everybody laughed and they clapped and they slapped their desks. That wouldn't happen today. We have made some change there. And the change that we need right now, and it needs to be everywhere, and it needs to start with kids when they are 1 year old, maybe 6 months old, I don't know. And that is to love nature, to stop seeing nature and water as resources for our pleasure and profit and, to make life, convenience, to make life easier. Water alone, we should look at it and say it is sacred. This is sacred. We are so lucky to have this gift on this planet, but particularly in this country, because so many people, I don't know if you've been reading about what's happening, the Po River in Italy, the major rivers in China. A story came across my desk yesterday. Is Europe ready to live without its major rivers? The Rhine River in Germany, who could ever imagine that this would be gone, right? So we have to stop thinking about this as, a way for us to build our great cities or to make our money or to help us do bigger and better. We have got to realign our relationship to nature, to the Creator, to Mother Earth. And we have to stop seeing ourselves as having dominion over others. As Indigenous people teach us, We are nature. So when we hurt nature, we hurt ourselves. When we protect nature, we're protecting ourselves. And this is the deep lesson that has to be learned. And the area of hope that really touched me doing the work, work for the book, I really felt there's a sea change. Now, is everybody there? Obviously not. You know, we're watching the destruction of the Amazon under that dreadful Bolsonaro. You can't even think of, aside from the human atrocities, the atrocities to the environment and nature with the war, the assault on Ukraine. I mean, so yes, I'm not saying everybody's changed, but I am witnessing a change, as I said earlier, that comes like a change in the weather. And I think it's a movement whose time has come. It's a movement whose time has to come. And it's the area that gave me the most hope in writing the book.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Maude. Thank you for elaborating on your incredible book, which you will have a chance to buy over there after this, and Maude will be around for signing. But I did wonder if anyone had any questions for Maude. We have a few minutes. I can open it up. We can open it up to questions. I don't know. Perhaps not. We covered a lot of ground.
Yes.
Fides.
Nature.
Nature.
The age of nature.
The age of nature. Yes. Oh, there's a mic coming.
Thank you. Hi, Maude. Thank you so much. I have a question. You mentioned being a grandmother and the effects of the next generation. Of course, we've learned quite a bit. I'm wondering, from the perspective of a mother and a grandmother, would you do it all again knowing the world that you're leaving to this next generation? Is it still hopeful, or is it something to be a little bit terrified for those who maybe want to think of starting a family someday soon? Because it's a kind of a scary thought.
I hear you. Absolutely, I would do it all over again. I adore these kids. They challenge me, they're funny, my husband said to the oldest, who's just 19, about to turn 20, she has bright red hair, and he used to call her little red-headed girl. He said, "What happened to little red-headed girl, Maddie?" She said, "Long gone, Grandpa, long gone," right? Like, get with the program. No, I hear you. I hear the concerns. I actually even write about it here, about some people who are making decisions not to have kids because they don't want to bring them into this world. But they're going to be the ones with you and with me and with my grandkids to turn it around. I mean, the thing that we have to understand is the issues that we're dealing with have been created by humans, we humans, and we can do something about it. And I have every faith that the young people that we're dealing with now, and I'm talking little kids, I work a lot with little kids, and they are just right on top of the issues. They really get it. So yes, I would say I would do it again in a heartbeat.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Please go ahead.
More than a question, I just want to say thank you so much for this very hopeful message. I'm a teacher, and I was telling my students that I was going to come and see you today. So I feel like a messenger. So this week, when I start to teach again, I want to share this message. So I want to thank you so much. Because my students sometimes tell me, what can I do? Yeah. Just what you're saying, you know, what can I do? And I tell them, we have to keep hope that many of us are working together, and we may not witness it in our lifetime, but we put a little grain of sand there. So I want to thank you so much for today's words. Thank you, Maude.
Thank you very much. Or as they say, you plant the tree even if you know you won't be able to sit under its shade. But it's, and you know, here's the thing. There's just such joy in being with people who care like this and who have the same values. I can get off a plane in a country far away. I met with people I've never met before, and we're like family because we're fighting for the same things. Like You know, we have different circumstances, but we get it with each other, and it's just that sense of solidarity that's fabulous. So I'll end with just 2 quotes, okay, because they're quite gorgeous. There's a woman named Robin Wall Kimmerer. Some of you may have read her. She's a prof at New York University, and she wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's just simply gorgeous language. And I just want to share this quote with you. She says, we will have to polish the art of seeing. And this is the quote. She says, this means listening to plants and heeding the lessons of the natural world. What would it be like, I wondered, to live with a heightened sense of sensitivity to the lives given for ours, to consider the tree in the Kleenex, the algae in the toothpaste, the oaks in the floor, the grapes in the wine, to follow back the thread of life in everything and pay it respect. Once you start, it's hard to stop, and you begin to feel yourself awash in gifts. I think that's quite gorgeous. And the last quote comes from a man named E. Ethelbert Miller. He is the poet laureate of Washington, D.C. He's also a big leader in the Black Lives Matter movement in the U.S., and he writes a lot about love and the need for more love, more kindness in the world. And he says this, and I'll just end the formal part of this with these lovely words, and to thank you, Katherine, for this great chat. He says, place your heart in your hands and blow gently. Spread love like seeds. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maude. I feel very emotional. I feel very, very blessed that you are with us today. So much gratitude. Thank you. And on behalf of the Word on the Street, I'd like to thank all of you for attending this event. Maude will be available for the next 30 minutes over at the Another Story bookstore booth over there to sign copies. Oh, there's a wave over there. Sign copies of her new book called Still Hopeful, Lessons from a Lifetime of Activism. I have the book myself. I've read it. It's absolutely incredible, and just right over there. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. Thank you, Maude.
Thank you, my darling.